So I wanted to spend a few minutes talking about how to negotiate a work-life balance. And I just want to say that this is an incredible challenge, especially in academia. And I love this tweet by Jacqueline Siegel, who went viral when she pointed out, in academia, you must be brilliant, creative, and organized. You must do this while teaching 3 to 4 courses, writing grants, publishing manuscripts, mentoring students, reviewing papers, serving on committees, and presenting at conferences. And yet academia is also telling you that work-life balance is critical in caps. And so there's an obvious tension here. Is it possible to do all of these things in such a successful way and maintain a work-life balance? And that impossibility is incredibly frustrating for people. So what I want to just start by saying is that there's really no such thing as an optimal balance. First of all, it's in some ways frustrating to impose this notion that there is an optimal balance because people are all struggling themselves to attain it. Another thing I want to say is that optimal balance is in some ways a fantasy, because what is an optimal balance for one person is going to be radically different from another person. That some of us might love our work, others hate it. Some of us might have families or other obligations outside of work, and others don't. And so those types of dynamics mean that some people might be happy working a 30-hour job. Other people might be happier working a 60-hour job. Of course, most people fall in the middle, but it reveals that what's an optimal balance for you is not something you should impose on somebody else, because we all have different goals, different constraints, different interests. The other thing I want to say, and this was a comment that was raised in Jacqueline's, when she tweeted that in the thread, there was somebody saying academia is built to spill in this regard. It's a unique problem. And then someone quickly points out, I transitioned from academia to big tech during the pandemic, hoping to leave that culture. Unfortunately, there's the same chatter without actually slowing down in big tech. And I've had students leave academia. One of my former students went into big tech and came to a lab meeting a few months after, and all the lab students wanted to grill him about what his job was like, and it was a pretty cool job. And someone asked, are you working less hours? And he's like, no, I'm working more hours. And this was a hardworking graduate student. And it reveals that you can go into non-academic jobs. And if you're at some of the high pressure, high status, high paying non-academic jobs, the pressure to work is high. In some places it's higher. And in many of those jobs, your work hours are monitored in a more detailed way. And so leaving academia is not really a solution to work-life balance. It might be for some jobs, but for many jobs, it just plain simply isn't. And you can ask this of people in other fields. I have friends who are lawyers or doctors, medical doctors, and their work hours are far worse because they're constrained by billable hours if they're in law, or brutal shift work, double shifts in medicine. And so this work-life balance thing in some fields is an absolute impossibility to achieve. And so you need to think very carefully about it yourself. And then also your needs change over time. As I mentioned before, kids changed my work-life balance simply because I couldn't work on weekends and early evenings anymore, just period, once I had kids. So that became an impossibility. In some ways, it was great because it imposed a work-life balance. Once I came home at 5 or 6, my work shut off for the night. And on the weekends, I couldn't work. And so it allows you to realize that work is just a part of your life. It's not everything. And there's other priorities. Sometimes those priorities seem far more important. On the other hand, it can be frustrating because if you're trying to balance all these other things at work, it can feel overwhelming at times. And this is especially true during the pandemic, where now my work ends at 1:45 when I have to go pick up my kids, or I have to teach a class while they're running around in the background. And so those things are incredibly stressful and overwhelming and lead to things like burnout. And obviously this is much harder. All the research shows on especially on mothers and during the pandemic as childcare has fallen away. So your needs will change over time. It will depend on who you are. It depends on the nature of your relationship. It depends on the stage of your career. And so that you need to therefore define your own balance, and it has to be in a fluid way. And because no one is going through the same things, and even you're not going through the same things at the same different stages of life, I first, as a recommendation, suggest don't impose your definition of balance on others, and don't let them impose their definition of balance on you. So you need to let go of, if you can, of those expectations and try to be respectful and mindful and give grace to others as they're going through it. And this is one thing where I hate the conversations on academic Twitter, because a lot of it is people defining balance and telling other people, and it's really framed in a moralistic way that if you work too much, that's immoral. Or if you don't work enough, that's immoral. Or if you don't do amazing in your teaching, that's immoral. Or if you don't do perfect in your research and use all the most recent methods, that's immoral. And it's framed in a way that's just absolutely devastating and brutal to people and demoralizing. And so we need to just let go of that at the get-go of this conversation. And you need to do a lot of self-searching and think about what you want to achieve and how you're going to balance out all of these things. And even for me, this is an ongoing conversation. At one point when I was a grad student postdoc, I didn't care about work-life balance. In a sense, I didn't even like the term because I thought you're supposed to find a career you love and then throw yourself into it. And I had done that. And I came from a blue collar background where like all of my family hates their job, for the most part. And I had found a job I loved and they didn't even believe that was possible. And so I get in these arguments about whether you could actually like your work and want to do your work. And so my notion of work-life balance came from escaping a culture where the philosophy was you work to live, not live to work. And I finally found a job I liked, and several members of my family they didn't believe that was even possible. So I wanted to embrace the possibility you can find a job you like, and that's important, and you deserve that. And people who come from backgrounds where that's not normative also deserve that right. But as I've got older and I'm trying to juggle more and more, I realize I do need to think very explicitly about this, or you burn out and it's too much. So I've embraced this in the last few years, especially since I've had kids, in a way that I just never did before. And I've also tried to think about how we balance that as a group. And part of that acknowledgement is abandoning the idea that you need to be great at everything. You quite simply don't, and you quite simply probably can't. There's maybe a few number of people who can be great at everything, but they might not have the additional burdens outside their life that you have, or barriers at work. So it's hard to strive to be them. It's harmful to yourself if you're striving for something that's impossible to achieve. So you need to set reasonable goals, and you need to identify what your goals are in your job. So I'll just give you an example in academia. If you want to get a research job, if you're a grad student or a postdoc, you need to focus on high impact publications. There's a recent study that's the biggest predictor of your job search prospects at an R1 type of job. And then that changes. If you want a R2 or R3 type job, or a teaching job, or a community college, you really need to focus on teaching. And especially if you want a liberal arts job, some schools really require evidence of teaching excellence. And so then you should spend maybe a summer or two building that teaching skills and learning how to teach and doing a great job of it and building your portfolio, rather than focusing on getting that extra paper out. If once you become a professor, it also opens up all these other possibilities. I have colleagues who really wanted to go into leadership or administration, be a dean or a university provost or something of that nature. And they need to build a different set of skills. They need to read about leadership and management and take on different responsibilities and service goals to build their portfolio and that skill set and that network. And so even once you become a professor, there's all these other pathways. Some people want to be public intellectuals and write books. I've seen some of them, like if they go all in that road, they often shrink their lab or their research scope. Some people are great theoreticians, other great experimentalists, but few people are great at all of these things. If you want to be a non-academic, you also need to think very differently about the skills. If you want to go into a think tank versus work in tech or government, those are different pathways with different networks and different skills required. And so you should be building those. And think sometimes if you want multiple doors open, try to build skills that open multiple doors. So for example, if you might want to go into tech and you're thinking about going into a research job, you might want to move into like computational social science would be a way in the past that I've recommended to my students who might be interested in both of those things, as opposed to say social neuroscience. And the other thing, the one thing I do like about our job is that we can think about what we accomplish. We don't need to think about how much time we work. And so I've used hours as an example because this is something that's constantly debated and moralized and leads to conflict. I once posted about the average hours from a study of professors' work. I think it was 50 to 60 hours in a study. Again, it was a small study. And the point was just that we work hard. We're not lazy. We're not taking our summers off. We're not just teaching our class and doing nothing else. I was trying to challenge that stereotype that diminishes the work that we do in academia. But of course, the conversation, as it often does in Twitter, went in a completely different direction, debating how much work and whether it's toxic to work 50 or 60 hours. And the whole point of the discussion, I think, is, and this got in the news, I think this discussion is a complete red herring. It distracts us from the actual real issue, which is, I think, is like, we don't need to punch a clock when we come in. And I've had jobs where if I was 5 minutes late, I got, talked to from my advisor. If you work in blue collar work, if you work at some place like Amazon in a warehouse, this is what happens to you. And some of you probably experience this, and it's really brutal. It also happens in white collar jobs, as I said, with lawyers and billable hours. You're punching a clock. And so you don't, I remember watching this for the first time as a kid on Flintstones, and Fred Flintstone would come in and punch the clock. And then the moment the whistle blew to leave work, he would be so happy and race out of there. And I've had jobs like that where I couldn't wait just for the time to be 4:30 so I could go home. So I did not like to work. I'm grateful to have a job now that I don't feel that way. But I like having a job where it's more about what I accomplish. And if I write the grant and it gets done, that's what matters. If I can figure out how to do it in fewer hours and be more efficient, no one punishes me for that. So you really set your own hours, and the priority is really on figuring out how to work smarter, not harder. And so you don't have to be, Fred Flintstone punching out a clock. And then, of course, what matters in our world is what's on your resume or CV. No one's tracking how many hours you work, at least in our lab, where I am not really tracking that. Obviously, if you work more, you can accomplish more up to a point, because if you burn out, or I find when I'm burned out, I can't write. I sit at my computer staring, or go to social media and just waste time, or check the news incessantly. I actually get less done. And so if I'm getting a good sleep and managing my life, then I'm able to use my time wisely. The other thing you can think of is how to build skills to make yourself more efficient. And this was advice I got in graduate school, is early in your career, you have more time to build skills. As you get more senior, like I am, you have other burdens, not just your parenting burdens and things like that, as you move into a different stage of life, perhaps. But my teaching and my service and my meetings, I can't get out of those. Those are all baked into my schedule. And so it means I have a small amount of flexible time each week. Whereas earlier in my career, I had a lot more flexible time each week. Now I've got about 10 hours of flexible time. Before, I had 20 or 30 hours of flexible time. And so I try to use that to learn more skills and make myself more efficient. And so that's something to think about right now. It's kind of like when you learned how to type. If you learned how to type originally like me, it was like home row, hunt and peck. And you got faster and faster at that. But eventually you realize you need to learn home row to get really fast. And at first, when you learn home row, it slows you down. But once you learn it, you become 2 or 3 or 4 times as fast at typing as you were before. So it's worth it investing, a few months or a year learning home row to make the rest of your life, every single email you write, every single text, every single paper, report, goes way faster once you've learned it. And so you can think of things like coding and data analysis through that lens. The other thing is you need to think about just your basic needs. And so in psychology, we're intimately familiar with Maslow's hierarchy. You need to manage your, friends and family and relationship, the sense of belonging, before you can start thinking about your achievement goals and your self-actualization to be, a scientist or whatever. Those are high order identity goals. I would add on here things like eating healthy. That's at the very bottom, right? Food, water, shelter. I would add on here sleep. We now know a ton of research, as I mentioned before, on sleep and cognition, or on burnout. If you work too long, you can't do the higher order things. So you really need to make sure you manage those things first, so you can even pursue these higher order goals. So you need to carve out time for these. And I would say, like, part of, managing your friends and family is carving out time to spend with them. Obviously hard in a pandemic, but I will say I had a really fun Zoom call with one of my best friends this week, and we had drinks, and it was just so much fun. We were laughing, and I'm just like, you forget how valuable that is to your mental health and your well-being. I got nothing done that evening, but I got way more done because it was just fun and refreshing and interesting. So make time for that. And I'll just say I bake time in this in my schedule. There's a reason why I don't do a meeting before 10 a.m. It's usually because I have to drop off my kids to school when they have school or daycare. And then I want to exercise. And so I need that time in the morning to make sure I can do it. And so that time is sacrosanct. I don't book any meetings in that time. And if people want to meet me, they have to meet me later. Admittedly, I'm fortunate because I'm in a position where I can set those goals. But it's important for you also. You do have some control over your time, not complete control, but think of it. And think of also lower powered people who are meeting with you, not to set meetings and times that impair their quality of life. And for many people, that might be their evenings or weekends. And so I try not to ever force people to meet with me on those times. Some people do, and I think it's really unfortunate. Obviously, it's rare cases where it's necessary, but I think that is rarely the case. And then the other thing is pace yourself. Your career is a marathon, not a sprint, or as I like to think of it, more like a long speed walk. And I've worked with people who at the start of every semester like work incredibly hard, but by the end of the semester, they're burning out and they're going home early and they're not getting anything done. If you just find a pace that works for you and maintain it, you can keep it for a longer period of time and go further. So think about what that pace is for you, and it's different for everybody. And then the other thing I talk about, early in your career, you have to say yes to a lot of things. But as you go through your career, saying no becomes more and more important because the number of things you can do grows exponentially and becomes harder and harder. So as you go on in your career, it becomes a critical skill to say no, not just at work, but in your life. And to achieve any kind of balance, you'll need this. So you have to learn strategies for saying no, optimally in ways that don't offend people. And again, if you're in lower power, learning these strategies becomes even more important because you have to do it in a way sometimes it's delicate. You also, I think one of my key pieces of advice is recommend others, because a lot of times people are asking you because they want somebody or they need somebody to help them with this thing. You can recommend them. Or you can make your advice more scalable. So this is something Tessa does in her lab, where she gets millions of emails about stats advice. She started recording in her labs, record all these videos they put on their website. And they've been like viewed 1,000 or thousands of times by people all over the world looking for stats advice. And because a lot of times you just give the same advice over and over. Or I draft an email to all prospective PhD students, and now I just put it on my website and I send them there so everybody can see it. It turns out also to be more equitable because people on my website can see it and they might not think to email me. But it's incredibly detailed and helpful, and it saves me responding to 100 emails every year. Added up over 10 years, that's thousands of emails I've saved back and forths. And those would even be incomplete because I couldn't possibly rewrite it each time. And then be equitable in your recommendations. Try to think of people from backgrounds who might not be considered. Don't always recommend a small number of people because those people are getting recommendations from everybody, so they probably can't do it. But also because it's not necessarily fair. You want to give it to people who might be interested, who aren't getting that opportunity, and might be good at it and could help them in some way. And then be respectful when others are saying no. So you have some power in creating a system, we all do, because this is partly a social dilemma about how we construct work, of not pressuring people incessantly or guilting them if they draw boundaries or say no. Occasionally, they might need to say yes. And we all have a duty, also a part of our responsibility to the field, to say yes to a certain number of reviews and service commitments. We can't just let it all fall on a small number of people because that's not fair. But we need to be respectful when others say no. And then here's a column we wrote in Letters to Young Scientists. You can read with some, Leah Somerville took the lead on this and has actual text you can use for saying no. And so I put a link there that you can all use. And then finally, and this is what we try to do in our lab, and you can go check this out in our lab manual, or you can search this on Twitter if you just use these keywords. We have a work-life balance that we created last year. And one of the great things about it was that I was surprised by how the diversity of perspectives in the lab. Some people didn't want to get an email after 5 or 6 p.m. or on the weekends. Other people wanted to work on the weekends, but just didn't want to be told to do it. So they actually preferred to do it, but with a sense of autonomy. And I think that's kind of how I often feel. I hate to be told to work at a certain time, but I like the flexibility to do it at odd times. Some people had other preferences. And so we tried to create a document that reflected the diversity of perspectives in a way that didn't impose on anybody and gave them the flexibility. Because it's one of the cool things about our job is that you don't necessarily have a 9-to-5 job if you don't want it. And some of you send me emails at 2 or 3 a.m. Because that's the time that you work best or like to work. And so we want to create a culture where people have flexibility. It's one of the cool things about our job, but not impose on people in a way that causes them distress or burnout. And so I think this is important. And I also think a policy benefits everybody, not just people in power like me from having boundaries with people about their expectations, but everybody. And it trickles down all the way to research assistants. And I also want to say, even if you're in kind of these middle stages of your career, like postdoc or grad students, you have power over people below you. And it's important to think about how you treat them and also making expectations clear in a way that's fair and reasonable. So any group, and this can include small research groups, labs, departments, I think it's important to think about these, and at minimum, find a compromise, and ideally also provide clarity, including things like when emails should be sent, how long is reasonable to respond, are working hours being tracked? Maybe there's some days where everybody should be in together, but maybe there can be flexibility about working from home on other days, and thinking about how to optimize it for everybody's success and well-being. And then obviously formalize it in some procedural or structural way so new members of the group can see it. And so anybody who wants more advice on this, I can turn them to the lab YouTube channel we've created, where we start sharing more and more of our advice about becoming more efficient. And I will say I got an email from a grad student, I think it was at Northwestern University, PhD student, who had started watching these and just really was grateful for them. So I just want to say that there is a way to also share the stuff you do come up with in a way that can help other people, you know, hundreds or thousands of miles away. And then we have a column which many people read, which is free and accessible on this and all kinds of other issues. So with that, I'm going to stop the conversation. And take questions or comments that